Welcome, CTA students. My name is Tahit Chappelle, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Department of State's Cannabis Training Academy, the state's online, no-cost technical assistance program aimed at helping you understand the cannabis licensing application process. Today, we are continuing our expert webinar series. These series brings the best and brightest subject matter experts from the cannabis industry, from state government, the ancillary market, and beyond. This webinar brings together several experts from various New Jersey labs to discuss the importance of lab testing, the roles labs play in the cannabis supply chain, and how people can pursue a lab license or work inside a lab. Now, we'll have each panelist introduce themselves.
My name is Jamie Rosenstein. I'm the Northwest Regional Director of Operations at Green Analytics. I've been in the cannabis industry about 4.5 years now. I was previously doing cancer research over at University of Pennsylvania, and I saw how much the cancer patients were relying on cannabis as an alternative form of pain management. And that really, made me want to join the cannabis industry and keep patients safe.
I'm James Anasti. I'm the lab director at Sriven Labs in the state of New Jersey. I basically fell in love with analytical chemistry in college and went that route. So I moved into toxicology. From toxicology, I was in pharmaceuticals, and I kind of just fell into cannabis that route through the analytical chemistry background. So that's my intro.
My name is Karrissa Miller. I'm currently serving as the Vice President at US Cannalytics, a multi-state cannabis testing lab. We've been in operation since 2018 in our flagship lab in Maryland. We opened in January of 2020 in Pennsylvania, Florida in 2021, New Jersey in 2021, and we are about to open in Michigan. My background is macro social work with a health and policy focus. And really, I was brought in to our first laboratory just to build the organization from an administrative standpoint, an operational compliance standpoint. And we've been very blessed over the last 8 years for that to grow into the 5 states that we are now. So certainly very excited for the opportunity to be here and speak about our testing labs here in New Jersey.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ahrens. I am an entrepreneur in cannabis testing, and I am the president of Trichome Analytical. We are the state's first ISO 17025 accredited and first CRC licensed cannabis testing lab. We are New Jersey homegrown and bred, and very proud of it. And we are the only woman-owned cannabis testing lab in the state, as well as the only testing lab that is also DEA registered, which is a big thing for us. And we work with a lot of hemp products as well. I am also currently a board member of the New Jersey Cannabis Association, which is a more recent development. And it stems from my involvement with the NJCBA that started about 3 years ago in developing and starting and founding the Laboratory Testing Committee, which is a group of scientists that have come together from various types of entities, not just labs, to educate, advise, provide scientific basis and knowledge to the regulators so they can make effective decisions when it comes to testing guidance, as well as governance of testing labs. So thank you for having me today.
So the first question is, what are cannabis labs and how do they play a role in providing safety to consumers, patients, and businesses?
So I would say cannabis laboratories are specialized testing facilities that are responsible for analyzing cannabis as well as other cannabis-derived products to ensure that they're safe, accurately labeled, and compliant with state regulations. I would say that the primary role that labs serve is to verify that products are free from harmful contaminants to whoever's consuming them, such as mold, pesticides, heavy metals, residual solvents, and also to quantify potency, namely the levels of cannabinoids like THC, CBD, CBG. And for consumers and patients, I think labs really help ensure that the products that they're using is both safe and consistent, so that brand stability is there. And for businesses, labs offer credibility and legal compliance. So they're reducing the liability and kind of building that consumer trust. So ultimately, I think testing labs are the quality assurance and really the backbone of the cannabis industry.
Something that I wanted to highlight is that cannabis testing labs in most states, especially here in New Jersey, are independent operators. So that means that partnerships or organizations cannot have co-ownership or shared financial interests between laboratories and cannabis licenses. So our New Jersey medical patients, our New Jersey legal adult use consumers can feel confident that their cannabis and cannabis products that the laboratories are testing are truly independent of these major brands or New Jersey-based licenses, to again ensure that products are safely tested, that they are compliant to state regulations, and that they are accurately labeled. From a reporting standpoint, laboratories also help consumers and medical patients identify products that may be helpful or supportive to their needs. So the laboratories, as Jamie mentioned so eloquently, are providing that potency data from a cannabinoid and terpene standpoint. And so patients and consumers can use those certificates of analysis or reports to help them identify the products that may best support their cannabis experience.
The second question is, where and when do labs play a role in the cannabis supply chain? We hear about seed to sale. We hear about farm to fork. We hear about you plant it, you water it, you grow it, you consume it, or maybe you roll up and then you consume it. Anyways, but we don't hear about you test it. So where and when do labs play a role in the supply chain?
So I would say labs become involved in the cannabis supply chain towards the end of the production cycle. So basically just before cannabis products are made available for sale. And so this is typically after cultivation and manufacturing, but before the distribution and retail. I'd also like to point out, that a lot of companies do R&D, so research and development with testing laboratories before they're even producing. So during that developmental phase of products or for internal quality control. And this is not used for regulatory compliance necessarily, but just for their own internal purposes. I would also say, that a lot of companies, especially cultivators, use cannabis testing labs as well to test for viroids while they're in the growing phases.
I mean, Jamie covered all the topics except for stability testing, I guess, is another thing that the lab is involved in the process. After the product is on the shelf, we basically maintain some testing at certain time intervals to make sure that the product is staying stable and that is safe and is still consistent to the original labeling of the product. So I guess that's pretty much.
Aside from the R&D testing, the compliance testing before products go to market can be sold, and stability testing, that's the bulk of it. But I think there's also another element that doesn't come into play as much, but probably should more, but also double checking and verifying. And something that was done recently in the market was more of a secret shopper initiative. So it's just an interesting double check verification that labs should be called upon if there's any question by a consumer at a retail establishment, a dispensary product that they feel might not be where it was labeled and sold as. Labs can serve as that extra verification process and rechecking.
One thing that laboratories in our experience can really serve the supply chain and the market at large through, as Jamie mentioned, R&D testing, and James mentioned stability testing, is laboratories hold a lot of data, a lot of technical expertise. And so what we find is laboratories can play a very critical piece to help licenses identify gaps within their manufacturing process. They can identify maybe potential areas of non-conformance or non-compliance, and are just general good resources of how to make your product the best that it possibly can be. Can you improve your packaging? Are there strategies that we can deploy to ensure your facility is more sanitary, more compliant, assistance with labeling, integration into sales and labeling systems. So laboratories serve as this multi-focal point that connect a lot of different types of stakeholders at the compliance and safety table.
How are labs currently regulated in New Jersey? What are you mandated to do and or test?
So labs are currently regulated in New Jersey by the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, who has issued a set of rules and guidelines for the general market to follow, right? From a testing lab perspective, what the initial rules were set by the CRC and the regulations that predated the CRC is that New Jersey would follow another state's testing guidance and standards until New Jersey could get on its own feet and set up its own testing guidance. So initially, this was, I want to say 2021, we started using Maryland testing standards and guidance. So we've been adhering to those testing standards since then. New Jersey has recently rolled out its own testing guidance. It was rolled out and then rolled back and to be determined as to when it's rolling out again. But it is progress that we're finally getting our own state testing standards to adhere to. So that is great, but maybe a little bit too late, too long, depending on how you look at it. It's been a long time coming. So what are we required to do and test? Certainly things like when a compliance sample or a batch or a lot of manufactured products or flour is ready for final testing before it can be sold, laboratory representatives have to go out on site to the client location and actually do the representative sampling. That's very important. It's an important first step of the testing process is to have accurate representation of a sample, as well as making sure that it's, from different bins, et cetera, and different parts of the lot manufacturing process, beginning, middle, and end, you name it. So we have to securely transport those samples back to the laboratory where we start conducting a large number of tests, all regulated by the testing standards that we're following today and testing guidance that we follow today. So that starts with a cannabinoid potency test, a terpene potency test. Then we've got additional tests for contaminants, such as microbial contaminants, total yeast mold, total aerobic bacteria, various pathogenic species. We've got heavy metals, pesticides, depending on the product. If it's a manufactured product, there's residual solvents. And there's some other minor tests involved in between, but those are the main contaminant ones. So there's a lot that we have to do and test for, and we have to be as accurate and as quick as possible and get those results out to our clients. So we can issue what's called a COA, a certificate of analysis. And that is the final report that goes into the metric track and trace system, as well as directly to our clients. So they can have that verification that the test has been done. And assuming it's passed, and generally that is the case, the product can then be sold to another business for additional manufacturing purposes, or for wholesale, or of course, to dispensaries and retailers.
So how laboratories are currently regulated in New Jersey, like Sarah mentioned, cannabis testing laboratories undergo the same annual business license and renewal process as laid out in NJAC 1730. But additionally, the New Jersey program requires testing laboratories to also be accredited to an international laboratory standard called IEC 17025 accreditation. So laboratories have kind of two separate, they must maintain their own internal quality controls and quality assurance programming that supports their international accreditation through 17025. And those are both parts of what goes into New Jersey testing requirements. So New Jersey requires you to have your 17025 accreditation first. That's a little different than some other states that may allow you to get licensed first and have a time, like a grace period to get your international accreditation. New Jersey requires it up front. So those are kind of like the two types of regulatory bodies, one being state specific and one being an international accreditation that all of New Jersey's testing licenses would have to comply by, as well as their internal requirements.
Thank you for that insight. And we're going to talk a little bit about this as we talk about potentially getting a lab license, but that sounds like quite a long process just by hearing that. So I appreciate that. We are going to go to the next question here. And Sarah, you mentioned a little bit about this. Everyone has touched upon it a little bit, but we're going to ask this question. And you can keep it basic too. You don't have to give out your IP on this. I understand. What are some basic tests used to identify possible things like mold, mildew, or other contaminants? And what happens if a product has mold or other dangerous contaminants on it? Can you talk a little bit about the process if that is found in the test?
So each laboratory is responsible for acquiring instrumentation or supplies and reagents that will support their analytical testing in-house. I think something that's very surprising to people if you're not familiar with analytical chemistry or microbiology is that every single test on that final report is generally a different instrument. So laboratories have generally over $1 million of extremely fine-tuned, very specific type of instrumentation that you can find in a hospital clinical laboratory, a toxicology laboratory. You can find them in environmental contaminant testing laboratories. So something really unique to cannabis is that we find lots of different realms of testing all under the same roof, where an organization is really kind of doing food testing and environmental testing and microbial testing, plus this high-level analytical testing for pesticides and potency and terpenes. And it's truly a very unique scientific environment for people. So when we talk about when there's a contaminant failure, the regulations in New Jersey are pretty clear on what needs to happen. So the laboratory is responsible for reporting that failure through the state seed to sale system called Metric, and issuing a final written report with the analyte and the test overall that failed. So if you had a microbial failure for yeast and mold, the laboratory's certificate of analysis or final report would have to report both the microbial failure, and the amount of that failure for yeast and mold, for instance. So we certainly don't like to see contaminant failures, but it does happen, and there is a standardized process that all of the laboratories should be compliant to.
So, I mean, Chris did a great job on answering the question, but I was going to add a little bit onto the topic of what happens if a product does have mold or other dangerous contaminants. Like, you know, the lab, that's another process, the step in where we take in the cannabis industry is we are basically the bearers of bad news. We do have to tell, you know, clients that their stuff has, you know, is contaminated or has stuff that's not safe. So there are ways that is handled. There are remediation techniques that are considered by the CRC, such as biorad sourcing, which basically radiates the cannabis material and kills living microbes. That's one remediation technique. And also another thing, if you have a bunch of cannabis with high contaminants, that you can extract it. So you can use it for a manufacturing step, pushing it forward through there. So that's what we would obviously suggest to clients, contaminated material. But other than that, it would be reported out as a failure, and they would have to remediate to move the product to any other steps.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, so thank you all for doing that job for me. Appreciate that. Thank you. I see Sarah has raised her hand. I will pass it to her.
James has a really good point about what steps can operators, meaning cultivators or manufacturers, take to, you know, if there is a product that's failed for contamination. It should be noted that not all contamination can be remediated out. Certainly microbial contamination, yes, there's definite technologies out there, and that is at least from a cultivation standpoint, the primary reason that a product would fail for contamination, or the higher probability that is that type of contamination. And so that can be remediated out easier. But as far as a pesticide or heavy metal, chances are that's not getting remediated out. I've heard some degrees of variation on that, but I've not seen it done. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It's not a widely known ability to remediate out pesticides or heavy metals.
I will not be raising my hand to volunteer testing remediated cannabis anytime soon. So y'all work with your instruments and hopefully and hope for the best. But I cannot be a guinea pig for that. So that's good. That's good to know, Sarah.
Well, just to note too, though, that it's not labs that are doing any of this remediation. The product it gets failed in the system and has to go, and then the operator can determine what they want to do with the product. And it can be, once it's remediated, it can be resubmitted through Metric and through the lab to do another sampling and testing round.
So these operators are using different equipment or their own equipment to determine the remediation process. Good to know. Thank you. How can labs provide even more safety for consumers and patients? I know we talked a little bit about COAs, but can you explain a little bit what they are and why they are important?
So I guess the easiest answer to this question would be just to add more pesticides. I think anything, add more analytes that we would have to test for that would be considered illegal contaminants. So expanding our panels for residual solvents, so adding solvents that would be involved in extractions. Pesticides, obviously, more pesticides. There's so many, designer pesticides probably that, are manufactured at levels which we actually wouldn't detect. But, manipulating the molecule and things like that, they create more families of pesticides, and we could add those to our panels, which would be more safety. I guess the other thing that we could do would be to create a very reliable stability program where we're actually compiling the data and we're learning from shelf life of cannabis material. I think that's something that's not really being looked into right now because we're such an early industry. But I think stability tracking and actually, trend data of actual results of things on the shelf would help the industry move forward and set limits that are appropriate to keep consumers safe.
I'm going to answer your question kind of in reverse and talk about COAs first. So a COA, or Certificate of Analysis, is required by NJAC 1730 and a Laboratories International Accreditation. And so what that is, it's a final written report where a patient or a consumer or a cultivator or manufacturer can look at all of a single sample set of testing data and make informed decisions based on those results. So what that can look like, from a patient or a consumer standpoint, is if you know that you have a sensitivity towards a specific terpene, you're using some sort of patient journal or, user kind of journal, what you like from a taste or a smell standpoint. Those certificates of analysis are perfect to help you decide between product A or product B. From a medical standpoint, if you're a patient and you know that you are immunocompromised like myself, maybe you're looking at the safety features or the safety compliance testing. So something that I always look for is the yeast and mold result, the aerobic microbial result. The state defines very specific action limits. But, if the action limit is 100,000 CFU per gram, 99,999 CFU per gram is passing. So an immunocompromised patient may consider a product, specifically flower, with a lower microbial load for their own safety. So we see laboratories helping, as Sarah had mentioned, about remediation. It helps our cultivators and our manufacturers understand what products may preemptively benefit from remediation. It also helps our cultivators understand what product is best fit for retail flower versus something that may be better supported as a manufactured good. So, laboratories are not making these decisions, but the data that our laboratories provide help stakeholders of all kinds choose the products that best meet their needs, and also choose outcomes for those final products that will best support that brand or that organization at large.
My answer might be a little bit more controversial in terms of the broader scheme of this discussion. But I'll just go ahead, and if you feel the need to erase it, go for it. But I think it's not necessarily something labs themselves can do to ensure more safety for consumers and patients. I think it's the broader market and the regulator's responsibility to do a little bit more. And I'll summarize it by saying that rules are only as good as the enforcement that comes behind them. So if the testing guidance that we as labs have to adhere to is not strictly followed, and there's no enforcement to ensure it's being followed, and there's no protocols to oversee how labs operate, or the level of detail that we're adhering to in terms of the just general requirements, then it becomes a problem. So then we are putting consumer health and safety at risk, and it's just detrimental to the entire market. So not to say that that is happening across the board, but it does happen. So when as they say, when the cat's away, the mice will play. It was a terrible analogy, but I think it paints the picture. Whereas if there's not a cat ensuring that the mice are, in order, whatever, terrible analogy, but you get where I'm going with that. So.
More for workforce development. A lot of our students may not want to get a license. They may want to work there, may want to work in a different part of the supply chain. So this is focused on jobs. What kind of jobs are available in a lab? And if you want to shout out, like, here are the type of roles or the type of titles and all that, that's really cool. And what kind of education is needed to be a possible candidate for some of these jobs?
So I would say that the education level is definitely varying across the board for the different types of jobs that are available for testing laboratories. So to name a few, let's start with field samplers. They're the people that collect and transport samples from the clients to the laboratories. In terms of education, a high school diploma or higher is needed, and they must be 21 years or older. These type of individuals need excellent attention to detail and customer service skills. We also need lab technicians. So these are people that handle sample prep, extractions, and basic, testing techniques. I would say the education level needed for this is an associate's or a bachelor's in chemistry, biology, or a related field. In terms of, a step above a lab technician, analytical chemists or microbiologists, these are people that are operating instruments like HPLCs, GCMSs, LCMSs, ICP-MSs. So the educated needed for an analytical chemist, I would say, is a bachelor's or a master's in chemistry or related science or higher. For microbiologists, they're conducting the biological contaminant testing, and they need, in terms of education, at least a bachelor's or higher in microbiology or a related discipline. Above this, you've got, compliance personnel, data specialists, metric specialists. These are people that ensure data integrity, managing reporting, as well as, assisting clients with metric issues. You also obviously need a lab director or a lab manager as well, quality analysts and quality technicians. So these are people that are overseeing compliance, they're overseeing reporting, validations of equipment, of protocols, and education levels needed for these type of positions, I would say, are more advanced. For a laboratory director, they should at least have a master's in science or a PhD. That's often required, or, with significant lab experience. For the other positions, I would say, advanced science degrees like master's and above.
It's important to clarify what a state requires from an educational or credentialing standpoint versus what an organization may require internally. So in New Jersey, there are not educational requirements outside of the laboratory director role. So as Jamie mentioned, there are requirements for any registered cannabis, an employee of any registered cannabis business. Again, that's an age requirement of 21 or older. Generally, it is a GED or some sort of high school diploma, and it is required to be able to pass a background check as required by the state of New Jersey. After that, it's really up to the organization to decide and define roles and credentials that are appropriate, to those responsibilities. So I'm always very encouraged as a social worker working, within a testing laboratory. Never when I was in a social work program was like, when I grow up, I want to work in a cannabis testing laboratory. But that's the beauty of labs. We're still businesses. So we still employ HR managers. We still have accounting and bookkeeping and, accounts receivable and payables and all these administrative things that don't require or may not require a hard science background. And so I would encourage your students to always reach out and to think about what skills that they have, things that can be transferable from other fields. If they're curious about getting into cannabis or cannabis science, cannabis testing, as Jamie mentioned, things like field sampling may not require an advanced degree or some sort of formal training outside of, being trainable and having a good approach with client management and client service. And there may be other positions like a lab assistant where, you're helping things like labeling and facilitating sample destruction. You're organizing supplies and keeping inventory that may not require any advanced degree or even background in a hard laboratory or natural science.
But going off of what Jamie and Karrissa talked about, New Jersey doesn't require specific education levels or experience levels per se in order to work at a licensed entity. Compared to another state like New York, where there's a laboratory has very specific levels of education for particular roles and et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot more flexibility with New Jersey laboratories compared to some other states where we can make the decision on who to hire. And if they have, 10 years of laboratory experience, but they don't have a PhD, could they still be our lab director? Yes. So things like that. Our lab director has more higher degree, but, not to say that somebody has to have one.
Do any of y'all labs offer like a fellowship or an internship or anything like that? Do any of your labs offer that? I see Karrissa say yes. Jamie, do you or Sarah, do any of y'all offer that for people?
I've definitely given a presentation on internships with laboratories through Stockton University, but we haven't gotten to the point where we've had a functioning program to work with yet.
Okay, good to know. Just
I
in
think,
case I get any questions about, do they do internships?
internships
Go
can
for
be
it,
a
Jamie.
little bit difficult just given that the CRC has to give individuals who will be working in the laboratory a badge, and that entire background process and fingerprinting process can be a little time consuming. And so for individuals who are just working for a summer, let's say, by the time they're cleared and then can actually start working in the laboratory and start being trained, it might be time for them to return back to school. So that's not to say, I would say, that it's not a wonderful thing for laboratories. It's just something to keep in mind.
I'd also say, as far as internships go, if you think about the average or the typical age of a college student, it's 18 to 22, maybe 23 is the average. And you have to be 21 to work in the cannabis industry. So it rules out a majority of the potential internees, I guess you could say, if they haven't graduated yet. I mean, certainly there could be internships post-graduation, but people are usually looking for a full-time job at that point.
Well said. Thank you
I was
both.
gonna say, and to all of those points, we do work with job development organizations. We do facilitate at US Cannalytics internship opportunities. We just always request that students reach out early in that process to make sure that they are getting their fingerprinting, to make sure that age verification can happen. And we do offer anything from a job shadowing where, you know, an individual is there purely to just observe and take notes and has the opportunity to ask questions about what it's like working in a laboratory environment, up to, you know, foundational extractions or baseline data analysis under the supervision of a full-time person. So, you know, it never hurts to ask. I would encourage anyone who's interested or curious just to reach out to a laboratory, be proactive and ask the question. And then, you know, if the answer is no, you didn't lose that much time, but you took your shot.
Well said. You never know what the answer will be, but always shoot your shot. Thank you for that. Last two questions. If someone wanted to ever go for a lab license, what are some of the basic things they would need to know before they even begin pursuing a lab license?
Having that entrepreneurial aspect in my trajectory of being in the cannabis testing industry, I will say, number one, do market research and talk to other labs, maybe even work at another lab. And if you can't work at another lab in the same state, or maybe it just doesn't work out job-wise, to get that firsthand acknowledge or experience and understanding of how labs in the industry operate, talk to other labs. And if labs in the same state where you want to set up a lab or start a lab aren't willing to talk to you, go to other states. Talk to labs in California or Massachusetts or Florida and understand what their experiences are, what challenges they have, what works well, what doesn't. I mean, it's super important to do your homework and know that things change very quickly. So even if you have a certain understanding of how the market's operating that day, 6 months later, it could look a lot different. So just know that you've got to really be nimble and understanding and risk planning as to where things might go.
Continuous education and research is very vital and very important to staying up to date on all the trends and the rules and the laws. Jamie, I'll pass it to you.
I would say, you know, when starting a lab, there's a lot to consider. So first thing that comes to mind for me is capital investment. You know, starting a lab can cost anywhere from $750K to $2 million, you know, depending on the scale and the instrumentation. As, you know, Karrissa and Sarah mentioned earlier, I mean, this equipment is not cheap and it is very expensive. You also have to take into consideration, you know, that a state licensing requires different applications, fees, regulatory demands. You know, you also need to hire a staff. So you need qualified chemists, microbiologists, lab director. You know, we just talked about staffing opportunities. That all costs money too. You know, you also have to consider lab accreditation. You know, as Karrissa and Sarah had mentioned earlier, most states require ISO IEC 17025 accreditation within a certain time frame of being licensed. That also costs money. You know, so I would say instrumentation is also important to keep in mind. So you need all the different types of pieces of equipment to be in, you know, accreditation with the state that you're operating in. So, you know, in New Jersey, you need HPLCs, GCs, LCs, ICP-MSs, and other, you know, micro equipment just to operate and meet the regulatory demands of this state. And that all costs a lot. You know, you also have to keep in mind like facility design, right? It needs proper airflow. You need to avoid, you know, contamination in depending on the activity that you're doing in each room. Security, you need HVAC. And then I would also say, you know, thinking about seed to sale software. So like metric integration, making sure that you have a robust, you know, computer and data management system in order to operate and be functional.
Yep. So as everyone mentioned, laboratories are definitely not for the weak-hearted. You better have some real thick skin and have a really diverse team on call to get through kind of that first year and a half. So, a lot of licenses have a little more agility and kind of room to grow. You can secure your facility. You can write an application yourself. Maybe you can do some build out. The problem is our scope of work is so diverse and requires so much very nuanced and specific knowledge of the technology that, it is very difficult to start a laboratory with 2 or 3 people. So you really do here in New Jersey, where you are required to have that ISO IEC 17025 accreditation first before you get your New Jersey laboratory testing license. You need a regulatory person. You need someone with a quality assurance background that understands that accreditation standpoint. You need, as Jamie mentioned, at least 7 figures, of capital, and that's just to update your facility. You need to be aware of the power requirements when you're looking at facilities. We have already, in some of our earliest labs, had to go back and pay to upgrade our local grid because there was not enough local power to support, the needs of the laboratory. So it's a lot of infrastructure and design, as Jamie mentioned. It is a lot of money, like Sarah mentioned. And there's really no way to get to licensing without a scientific staff, because to get to licensing, you have to get through that 17025 accreditation, which means you need scientific staff readily available to do the work. And then you're in a holding pattern. So again, that capital piece, you could wait 6 to 9 months to get licensed, and you may not take in a sample for a whole year after licensing. So, you need to be extremely cost effective upfront, and you need to be extremely, extremely well funded, because even if you get through licensing successfully, you still need to differentiate yourself from your competitors to get money and samples in the door. So it's extremely aggressive. For full transparency, operators are running on very slim margins. Cost of laboratory supplies continues to go up, just like everything else in life. And, the laboratories that are going to succeed long-term are the ones that can provide an extremely competitive price, which is really, really hard to come by if you're not leveraging a lot of samples walking through the door every day.
Well said. Have a runway and have a lot of money. That seems like that's the trend, no matter what license you're going for, is to make sure that you are well capitalized and thinking ahead. Thank you so much for that insight. And the last question for all of our panelists that I will ask everybody is there anything else that patients or consumers or entrepreneurs or those that are just curious about labs, what else should people know? Is there anything else that you'd like to say as a final word? And I will start with Jamie.
I would say, labs are really the last line of defense. While cultivation and manufacturing carry their own safety responsibilities, it's really our responsibility as laboratories, for that final check, before products reach dispensary shelves. And I think with testing labs, it's not just about testing potency. It's about testing, for everything that the state requires, to keep patients safe. And, as a consumer or a patient, look for the COA. You can always request a COA at dispensaries to see, exactly what you are getting.
I think what we always hope at US Cannalytics that patients or consumers know is that laboratories should be a resource to all of our stakeholders, especially in New Jersey. So for us, it's really important that medical patients especially, but even legal adult use consumers make informed choices, and that we understand, our reports help people make decisions that support themselves every single day. So I I think as laboratories, as we've discussed, we are the bearer of bad news from a cultivation or manufacturing perspective, right? We're the ones that are going to say a product is not safe or may not be accurately labeled. But we're also the guardians of that to the consumer, as Jamie mentioned. And so, there's always a lot of news about laboratory fraud or, a consumer concern about, is the laboratory doing its job? And I want to be really clear that, we work with laboratories we work with our competitors in most of the states that we operate in. And I think most laboratories that have been around for a long time got into this to do the right thing with the patient in mind, with that end consumer in mind. Excuse me. And so if you as a consumer or medical patient have questions about what a laboratory is doing, we would encourage you to reach out because we're here to support people making informed decisions. And so, we hope that everyone understands that the laboratory is that final piece of the puzzle. They are here to keep people safe. They are here to make sure that product is accurate. And if there's any questions about what that looks like at a laboratory, if you have a brand that you love and you're loyal to, get their contact information. It's generally on that certificate of analysis. And I would encourage people to reach out to have questions answered so that they can feel even more secure in the choices they're making at the dispensary.
So one of the reasons I got into cannabis testing in the first place is because I, as a human, a consumer in life, no matter what the product, and for myself, the things I buy for myself, what I buy for my family, I appreciate transparency. I appreciate knowing what's in products, where the products came from, making sure there's no harmful substances. I buy organic, I read labels, I'm obsessive about it. And so it's part of that passion that has propelled me in everything that we do at Trichome Analytical. And my team feels very strongly as well, and my partners at Trichome. We have a high degree of integrity in everything that we do. It's super important to us. And unfortunately, it does mean that we deliver bad news to clients on occasion. It is the worst part of our job, but we are ensuring that the products are safe that go to market. In addition, New Jersey allows for consumers to get product tested, which is so critical and important. So consumers can come to Trichome or another lab and say, hey, I'm not sure about this product. I have health concerns, or even some patients have very sensitive issues around certain terpenes, or, certainly there's immunocompromised patients. Anyone who wants to just double check and verify that the product is labeled accurately, is actually contaminant free, we encourage to take to a laboratory such as Trichome or another and have it tested if there's any medical concern whatsoever. And so there is a pathway to ensuring consumer safety and that consumers do feel safe. But I think generally in any market, and I think even more so in a emerging market that's still trying to figure everything out, because no market has it perfect as far as cannabis goes. But in an emerging market like New Jersey, one that is still working to get fully established and get its feet under it, and one that isn't necessarily governed or the rules aren't exactly governed in the way that some of us would like them to be. It doesn't hurt to get additional verification, and just as the saying goes, buyer beware, or caveat emptor, like just do your due diligence, look up the lab, ask people, in the industry what they think about, the accuracy of the data coming out. And that's important too.
Everyone nailed it. I'm just going to reiterate, the labs in New Jersey are a resource to the consumer. They're not just to the industry. And I mean, the consumer is one of the most important parts of the industry. So Labs should be seen as a resource, and like Sarah said, double test your samples whenever you want. The state of New Jersey, you're allowed to accept consumer samples, so use the resource when you can, and whenever see. And to reiterate what Jamie said too, is ask your dispensary for C of A, and then read the C of A and look at it and make decisions upon that. Not just a potency number or something like what a bud tender tells you to do. I think you are the last line of defense for yourself. So use the labs as a resource, and yeah, keep yourself safe.
All excellent insights and input. Everybody, thank you so much again for joining me for this pivotal and very important conversation and topic. I truly appreciate your insight. I know students will very much walk away with a lot more information that they ever have known about labs and what they, as patients and consumers, can do too.